Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. This is a first for the Intentional Encourager podcast. The first time that I have had a set of brothers on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Way back in episode 6, we had Jason Romano, our good buddy, host of the Sports Spectrum podcast. And now we've got a tremendous opportunity to have his brother, Pastor Chris Romano, joining me this morning on the Intentional Encourager podcast. There's going to be a lot of similarities, no doubt, because of those guys. Jason gave me a little bit of insight, so I know how to ask his brother the right questions. But Pastor Chris Romano joins me on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Chris, how you doing today, man?
I'm wonderful, Brian. It's so good to be with you. And yes, my brother and I are sort of attached to the hip together. We're in this together. And so I'm real grateful for him and the opportunity just to be with you and your audience today.
You know, Chris, it's funny, and we were talking before we got started, how connection really flourishes and how people are just joined together in all different walks of life and things like that. I got to imagine as a pastor, and let's start here. It is a challenge being a pastor. I know my late father was a pastor the last 3.5 years of his life. Talk to me about pastoring in a pandemic. How has that been for you pastoring during this time of COVID-19?
Yeah, well, I think just setting aside pastoring just for a second, I think all of us as people have had to make adjustments. And those of us who are willing to make those adjustments, to kind of get outside of our norms and those things that, our routines and our comforts, the things that we try to protect so much because we rely and trust upon them so much. The ones who weren't willing to adjust that, I think really experienced some tremendous hardships. Now, for me as a pastor, I'll just give you some inside info here, Brian. We weren't even live streaming. We were podcasting our services, but we weren't even live streaming. So we had to switch pretty quick once February, March came along, and obviously our church services looked a lot different. People weren't coming, and so we had to find a way to reach people and connect with people. And it was huge. It was a huge adjustment in that regard. But just for me personally, how do you now in a virtual world, how do you make those connections? How do you make those touches that are so important for people? And that really kind of set us into a whole new way of doing church.
Well, and again, we faced a similar situation in my home church here in Charleston, West Virginia. Chris, we had 32 people in our church of a little over 300 that were directly impacted with COVID-19. So for 3 weeks, we didn't have any services at all. We were totally locked down because we were trying to get folks well, and we were trying to do what we could, be responsible citizens about, making sure that people were healthy and taken care of and things like that. And I'll tell you this.
For sure.
I was keeping in touch with my pastor on a daily basis because I felt like that was what the Lord would have me to do, was check in on the pastor, because a lot of times, let's go here for just a quick second. A lot of times the pastor is so busy checking in, and just to your point about touching other people, you get so busy checking in on other people that it's a lot of times you lose yourself in the work of God, and you lose yourself in that part. Were there times during this pandemic that it felt overwhelming for you, or you kind of felt like, hey, I need to kind of take a step back and take a breath for myself because of what I'm trying to deal with so many other people?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think the whole year has been overwhelming, and it's really caused me. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I have a network of people that I talk to, bounce things off of, and we share our hearts and our perspectives. So I kind of get a sense of this being something that's similar for a lot of people, but it was really for me a shift back into intimacy, a realigning, a reorienting of what is most important to God. And so I would exchange those feelings of overwhelming anxiety, fear even, and exchange those for the peace of God, the presence of God. That again, we get so focused on meetings, right? I mean, church has largely become in the last several decades about the meeting, and we're meeting to death, right? We have a Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and we've been conditioned to experience God in those meetings. And so when those meetings weren't there, it was sort of a call back to intimacy, the secret place, and really begin to experience Him, within the four walls of our own home and within the context of our own families.
What did you learn most about leadership during this time? Because again, when people look to the pastor, whether you're churched or not, whether you belong to a body of believers or not, whether you're a Christian or non-Christian, a lot of times a pastor has to lead a lot of different dynamic personalities. It's not unlike leading a team in business. It's not unlike leading a sales team, if you will. What was the one thing through this that you learned about your leadership style or leadership that you go, man, I'd forgotten that I did that well, or I think I need to do this a little bit better?
Yeah. That's a great question. That's a really good question. I think I'm still discovering those things even now. Remember, I live in New York, so we actually had no services for 2 months. We were shut down completely from the 14th of March to about the 14th of May. But in light of it all, we've seen the whole pandemic, obviously combined with the fact that we had an election, in the midst of it, and we had racial unrest, and we had all these things that were going on, sort of in the midst of it, and they were intertwined. I don't think anybody who's, really paying attention, is ignorant to that. But for me as a leader, I recognize that people are so quick to submit to fear, and myself included at times. And so as a leader, it was my responsibility. Sometimes this was intentional and sometimes it wasn't. It was just sort of a response out of the reservoir of who God has made me to be. But it was important to bring the vision back into people's eyes and bring them back into people's hearts, and to speak to fear and to confront the fear that was so paralyzing in people. And so as a leader, I recognize that now as we're coming out of the pandemic, it's still important to make sure that I'm out in front of people doing that, so that people can begin to experience, what God wants for them.
I love what you said there, because, and Chris, I'll go back to, I'm going to get carnal for just a second, if you don't mind. One of my favorite movies is The Replacements. It's the movie with Keanu Reeves and Gene Hackman. I love that. I love that movie. There's a scene early in the movie where Keanu Reeves' character, Shane Falco, it's a big spot in the game. And, basically he comes to the sidelines and they've got the play called, and they call the play in, and it's designed for him to keep it, and he gives the ball up. He comes back to the sidelines, and Gene Hackman's character, Jimmy McGinty, says, great players want the ball. And so you fast forward into the scene later at the end of the movie where they come to the sidelines. It's a huge spot in the game. And Jimmy McGinty says, what's it going to be, Falco? And Keanu Reeves' character says, I want the ball. And he says, winners always do. And so that reminds me, you were talking about fear. The Bible tells us that perfect love casts out all fear.
That's right.
And so, and the other scripture that comes to my mind is God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. And so we know these principles, and these principles are universal, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, because
that's absolutely right.
Yeah. You can't operate in fear. You can't lead in fear. And it's amazing to me that what you said there, I want to just park here again for just a quick second about
Sure.
people giving into fear.
Mhm.
From a ministry standpoint, was that one of the hardest things that you've had to do in ministry, was to beat back that fear in people? And what did it tap into you as a minister and as a servant leader to say, if I'm going to overcome this or help my people overcome this, my congregation overcome this, I've got to do this differently?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, fear, I think, is the greatest hindrance to people walking in the simplicity of trust and devotion to God. It really
Man, say
is.
that. Say that again, please, if you don't mind. That is so good. Please
Yeah.
say that again.
Yeah, I'll try. But I believe that fear is the greatest hindrance to people walking in the simplicity of trust, childlike trust, I think I would add, and devotion to God. Because fear keeps people from exercising faith. And you could talk about this in a lot of different ways. And I love how you said it's universal, because this isn't just a Christian reality. This is a people reality. People who are bound by fear will be bound by hesitation. They won't take risks. They won't venture into the unknown. And so, when it comes to those of us who are believers, I mean, you quoted 2 scriptures, but you could have quoted 100 scriptures, because God is always speaking to the fear that keeps people from entering into agreement with his purposes. Joshua, be strong and courageous. You go down the line of every single great man or woman of God, and it came back to the option that each one of us have. Are we going to live by faith, or are we going to live by fear? And that was really, I think, at the forefront of what we face as pastors, as leaders in the pandemic, is really reorienting people to the fact that you can trust God, even in something that we've never experienced before, even something that just seems so overwhelming. We can trust God, and God's going to have the final say, and he has, and he will.
Take me through, you were talking a minute ago about being meeting oriented and having to now bring it for a period of time, because you talked about 2 months, bringing that back into your home. When you think about being at home with your wife and your 5 kids, what were you doing internally to help them get through it and lead them? Because you've got young adults like I do. You've got a 21-year-old, a 19, a 17, a 15, and then a baby. And we'll talk about the baby story here in a little bit. But you've got young adults and teenagers with you and your wife, and everybody handles crisis and chaos and turmoil and upheaval differently. What if you don't mind me asking, what were you doing in your home to help kind of stabilize your family through that?
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about before the pandemic hit, as 2020 started, was that we wanted to develop a culture of consecration. And that was within our home. That wasn't like a corporate, like churchy type thing over our congregation. It was our home. It was my wife, it was me, it was our marriage, and it was our 5 children. We were going to build and establish a culture of consecration, which meant a emphasis on the secret place. And lo and behold, again, this was before the pandemic hit, but I was challenging all of my children and really encouraging my wife that we weren't going to experience God more on Sunday morning or Friday night or Wednesday night than we were going to experience him in our home. In fact, we were going to see more miracles and the wonders and the signs of God in our own home, more than we were going to see him in the church. And so that was what we were set up for. And then the pandemic hit. And of course, one of the biggest adjustments that beyond not going Sunday morning was, our kids weren't going to school. So I have a son. It's actually pretty symmetrical, Brian. We go son, daughter, and then we adopted a baby girl. So she kind of broke the order of things. But yeah. So my oldest daughter was graduating high school. So she was a senior. So she had her senior year pretty much taken away. And then my youngest son, who was a sophomore at the time, he plays 3 sports. He's a 3-sport athlete. He had his football season, but he had basketball shortened, and then he had baseball taken away. And so we had all these things going on. So it was really about trying to help them to navigate through all of the chaos, and then bring them back to that reality of God is so jealous for our attention. I don't know what's going to happen on the outside, but we can control what's going to happen on the inside. We can control what happens in this house. And so that's what really we set out to do.
I got to ask you this before we take a quick break. I want to go here for just a second. And I mentioned your brother off the top, your brother Jason, but you also have another brother, Damien. And I've not gotten to meet Damien. I want to. How are you guys staying connected, you 3 brothers? You guys have grown up close. Jason wrote a lot about it in his book, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. How are you staying connected with your brothers? Because you guys get together as often as you can, living in different parts of the country. How important was it to stay connected for you with your brothers, and how did you guys pull that off?
Facebook Live.
Zoom calls like we're Zoom recordings like we're doing now, huh?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, we talk a lot. I know Jay and I talk at least once a week. We're always texting each other. So that wasn't really disruptive, but we actually did, Brian. We did a monthly Facebook Live where the 3 of us would come on, and we just talked about, one of the great affections that we all have, and that's sports. And we just rambled, the 3 of us, and we had a great time doing it. A lot of people, from all of our spheres of influence sort of came on, and we had a great time. But yeah, like any of us, that's sort of how we remain connected.
Step aside and we'll take a break and be back in just a moment here on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton here. I want to tell you about our sponsor, SEO National. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Now, what's that, you might say? Well, Search Engine Optimization helps you show up higher on search engines in front of paying customers for words that you as a business owner can monetize. What a great concept. SEO National is owned by my good buddy Damon Burton, who's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Not only has Damon and his team worked with businesses of all sizes, from e-commerce startups to NBA teams and Shark Tank featured businesses, but more importantly, Damon and his team are about transparency, trust, and providing lifetime value. So much so that he still has his first customers after opening SEO National 14 years ago. Let me give you some intentional encouragement and call Damon and his team today at 855-736-6285 or go to www.seonational.com and get a free quote.
Chris, you were talking a minute ago about sports, and if you're watching on YouTube, I've got an ESPN pullover on. It's the same one I wore when Jason was on, and so I'm a long-time sports guy. Let's talk a little sports here for just a few minutes, because again, I think we were all really just kind of navigating and feeling our way back. You're in upstate New York. I'm in southwestern West Virginia. You mentioned your son being a 3-sport athlete. What's this year been like for him getting to play football? We're just now getting back to playing basketball here. I do PA for my son's Christian school that he graduated from. So we've only played 3 games as we record this podcast. What was sports like being a big part of your home with your son playing sports, you being a passionate sports fan like you were? What were those few months like for you guys not having that ability to connect through the power of sports?
In one sense, it was like, and I assume a lot of people who listen to you and watch you, are also sports fans. Probably not all of them, but I'm assuming a large majority of them, because you can feel your passion for sports when you listen to your podcast. So this might not sound relevant for everybody, but for us, it was literally like the loss of a loved one. Not having sports, devastating.
And I mean to interrupt you there. I have been for the last, goodness, I would say probably at least 20 years, I would have Reds opening day circled on the calendar because I'm a Reds fan. And I would have that day circled on the calendar. So I would be somewhere where I could work, to get the biggest part of my day done. And now they keep bumping the opening day time back. So it used to be they used to start at 1:15, then they bumped it back to 2:15.
Yeah.
And now, the last few years they've started at 4:15. I'm like, this is great because I can get my work done, or what I have to finish up, I can finish up on the computer in front of the TV. Last year was so weird because, in Cincinnati, which I'm 3 hours east of Cincinnati, opening day is a holiday. I mean, the city of Cincinnati shuts down for opening day and not having that. And, of course, now we're coming up as we record this on March Madness, on the NCAA tournament. We didn't have that last year. The NBA Finals were pushed back. Major League Baseball played a 60-game season in 2020. So, yeah, what you're saying is it was like the loss of a loved one. It's like the Reds aren't playing today. What's going on with that? So,
yeah.
But how did New Yorkers handle that? Because you live in a state that is, and you really helped me geographically here. You guys are kind of in the middle between the New York area sports teams and, of course, to the north of you, the Buffalo area sports team. So you're kind of in that melting pot there. And I know you to be a Philadelphia Eagles fan, which you got to tell me how that happens living in upstate New York, and your brother, a Dallas Cowboys fan. So, but how did New Yorkers
Oh, man, don't go
that?
there. Don't go there, Brian.
I know that. And listen, there are more Dallas Cowboys fans that I know. Hey, try being a Cincinnati Bengals fan all your life, and the Cowboys are playing the Bengals in 2020. And I get texts going, man, we feel sorry for you guys.
Yeah.
But take me through how New Yorkers you live in such a sports crazy state. How are people around you and your friends, your sphere of influence? How are they dealing without having sports?
Yeah, it was devastating. I mean, really, I used that metaphor earlier, but it was devastating. Being without sports for, so long, and it really is just kind of coming around. My son lost, his spring sports in his sophomore year, and then he lost his which is his first love, football. My son's first love is football. He lost his, junior, senior season this fall, and then basketball again in the winter. We weren't playing. We actually just started basketball 2 weeks ago, and it's an abbreviated season before he starts spring football, which they, so he's still going to have his junior year for football, but they actually moved it to.
So how is he keeping in shape? Because there's different shape that you get yourself into for football.
Yep.
It's more weight training and things like that. Basketball obviously is more cardio. How is your son keeping in shape to do both? Because it was really, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, wasn't it really a kind of a, well, we'll wait and see. We're looking to this date, at least the way it was here in West Virginia. We're pushing to this date, and then the governor comes out and goes, well, we're going to have to push it back a little bit.
Right.
How was your son dealing with that stop-start mentality around when he was going to get to play sports?
Yeah, it was hard. It was hard. And again, I really kept emphasizing to him, and my son, I'm so proud of him. He's anchored in his faith. And so that was really what kept him from going out of his mind. And yet, even within the midst of that, there's still days and even weeks sometimes where, again, he is so committed to sports. Our whole family is. And so I'm just kind of go back to the question you asked previously about New Yorkers, particularly because we were without sports for, 3 months or so. I think basketball and baseball came back late in the summer. But it was one of those things where it just was so surreal. It was so strange. The routine of people like us who are so used to, if we're not at a game or if we're not preparing for a game or going to see one of our children, we're watching games, and you couldn't do that. We found ourselves going back to YouTube just to watch old games, just to sort of, feed what was lacking. And then thankfully ESPN came out with the series on Jordan, the Bulls. The last
that was incredible.
dance.
That was incredible.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
It was.
Well,
Yeah.
and I'll tell you this, it was a great bonding experience for myself and my basketball crazy 20-year-old, because he would rather watch an NBA game than he would watching it. I'm more of an NFL guy. I watch football, and he's more basketball. Yeah, he's more basketball oriented. But for me to be able to tell him, hey, this was what it was like to be a Bulls fan in the 90s. This was what it was like to be an NBA fan.
Yeah.
And Chris, I'll tell you this. Here's the biggest difference that I saw, and I wanted to tell you, and I told him this. I said, Bryce, the biggest difference is, do you see how many 7-footers are on the court?
Right.
Actually playing in the post. Actually playing in the post. Yeah. He said, well, where's your 7-footer going out to shoot? And I'm like, well, really the only guy that did that was a guy like Bill Laimbeer for the Pistons. Yeah. And then when the Bulls got Tony Kukoc, he was 6'11", shooting from the wing. But beyond that, he
was the European.
Exactly. A great point.
So that brought a whole different element. Yeah.
Great point.
Brought a whole different element.
Well, and ESPN capitalized on the fact that they weren't going to release that thing till right around the NBA Finals, and they saw that dearth of, which I'll tell you this. To me, I wish that ESPN would have said, we're ramping up production on 30 for 30s, because they could have done 30 for 30s every night, and I would have been locked in. I would have,
totally.
Yeah. Well, my favorite 30 for 30 was Rand University, because Randy Moss played at my alma mater, Marshall University. So, I mean, it's,
you're a Marshall. You're a Marshall alum.
I am a Marshall alum. That's 100%, man.
Chad Pennington.
Yeah, Chad Pennington is a son of Marshall. In fact, his son Cole is coming to Marshall here in a couple of years. So that tradition is, and he was talked about. We just had a head coaching opening a couple of months ago, and Chad Pennington was talked about filling that opening. Of course, Byron Leftwich was the offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Marshall quarterback. So it was a fun stretch of about 10 or 11 years watching all these great pros come through Little Huntington, West Virginia. But I got to ask you this real quick before we get into your story. How do you grow up in the house that you grow up in? Because most families are pretty united about the teams that they root for. How diverse, how did the diversity end up in the Romano household growing up with you and your two brothers just being so diverse in the teams that you root for and follow? I mean, there had to be rivalries. Your poor mother, man, she just must have been just a constant peacemaker.
Yes. She still is. Yeah. And our wives are too. But it's one of those things, Brian, when I look back at my childhood, and Jay and I particularly always talk about this. We wish we were fans of the same teams. But it really does stem from our story with our father and a lot of the dysfunction that came there. I can only speak for me. We come out of the womb, loving sports, because that's my dad, that's my grandfather, that's just our uncles. I mean, everything. But I had such a strained relationship with my dad that I actually, as a young child, Brian, chose the rivals of his teams. So he's a Giant fan. I chose to be an Eagles fan. He's a Celtics fan. I chose to be a Lakers fan. He's a St. Louis Cardinals fan. I chose to be a Pittsburgh Pirate fan on purpose. Just to sort of retaliate against them. And for me, I'm a loyalist. So like when the Pirates went through that 20-year stretch of losing seasons, like I don't change teams. I'm loyal to, the front of the jersey. I'm not loyal to the back of the jersey. And so I'm a diehard Eagles, Lakers, and Pirates fan, mostly because of, my struggle with my dad.
I'm wondering though how you became a Pittsburgh. I know because they're in the same. They back in the '80s. They were in the same division.
Right.
But man, oh man, the Mets were a way better team back then.
I know.
I'm a Reds fan because I came out of the womb and my dad was like 2 months old. He's like, you're watching Reds games with me. And so I grew up being a Reds fan even to this day. But man, the Pirates. Go ahead.
I got a quick story. So if you remember in the early 80s, now the Pirates had a great run in the 70s, at 2 titles, Clemente on the front end, Stargell, and We Are Family on the back end of the 70s. And then the early 80s, they were bad. Yeah. But Chuck Tanner, who was the manager, he was sort of the constant sort of steady Eddie kind of guy, and so I don't know. I was drawn to guys like Bill Madlock, who was a third baseman, and I'm young. I'm like 7, 8 years old, and then it really kind of like just changed for me and then for us as fans dramatically when Barry Bonds came in the mid 80s. And then they had a great run in the late 80s, early 90s. The Bonds, Bonilla, Andy Van Slyke. I mean, that was a tremendous run. Unfortunately, didn't end in a championship. But yeah, I think it goes back to the Bill Madlock influence. I played third base in Little League. I wore the number 5. He wore number 5. I think I'd have to go back to that, Brian.
I am such a baseball nerd. Of course, the Pirates in '79 took out my Reds in the NLCS.
Yeah.
I am such a baseball nerd. I remember the lineup for the '79 Pirates.
Wow.
I am such a baseball
you're better
nerd.
Than me on that one.
Well, you had the platoon, you had Lee Lacy in left, and then you had Lee Lacy, and then you had Mike Easler played left field. You had Omar Moreno played center. Dave Parker played right.
Yep.
Stargell played first.
Yep.
I'm blanking on this. Yep. Tim Foley, Phil Garner played second. Tim Foley played short.
Played short, yeah.
Bill Madlock played third. Ed Ott. And then his backup was a guy named Steve Nicosia. You remember Steve Nicosia? Backup catcher?
Vaguely, man. I mean, I was born in '76, so that's a challenge.
Yeah, and then so their starting rotation, obviously they had the great John Candelaria. They had Rick Rhoden.
Candyman.
Rick Rhoden pitched for them. They had a guy that pitched. He was a starter and a reliever. That's from about 25 minutes from here, a guy named Don Robinson. Great athlete from this area, Don Robinson. He great hitter. I mean, the Pirates used him a lot to pinch hit back in the 70s and early 80s. But Don Robinson, they had Kent Colvey.
Kent Colvey. Yeah, I was gonna say he was part of that championship team, right?
Yeah, he was the closer on that team. Yeah, and the old pillbox hats that they wore, the black and the gold and the alternate top.
I have one.
Oh man, that is
I wish I could dig it up.
I wanted to go back and get one, and they've done the throwback hat. So the Pirates have worn the pillbox, as throwbacks. But man, what a great! And again, you think about those times, and for me, I don't know if you've gotten to meet any of the broadcasters or anything like that, but just as big a thrill for me growing up as a Reds fan was meeting Marty Brennaman and Joe Nuxall, the guys that called games, and of course in Pittsburgh that was Steve Blass, who called Pirates games for
just retired.
Forever. Yeah. And so, and PNC Park is beautiful. If you have not been to a game at PNC Park, you got to go to a game at PNC Park. Let's step aside, take a break. I want to get into your story with the remaining time that we have and really dive into that. You're listening to the Intentional Encourager podcast. Be back in a minute. Hey, everybody, Brian Sexton. Want to tell you about my new book, People Buy From People, 10 Powerful People Lessons from the Ultimate People Person, my dad. My dad was one of the greatest connectors that I ever knew, and he shared with me 10 connecting principles that I have used throughout my 25-year sales and sales management, customer engagement, and leadership career that I'm passing along to you. If you want to be a stronger, deeper and more powerful connector, you've got to pick up a copy of People Buy From People. There are concepts in there that you may not realize help make you a power connector. You can go to Amazon and pick it up, Kindle if you're an e-reader and you like to do it that way, or now available on Audible. And there's one other way you can get a copy of People Buy From People. You can get one from me and I'll sign it for you. You go to intentionalmediaandpublishing@gmail.com and send me an email, and I'll share with you the link on how you can get a signed copy. You can buy a signed copy directly from me. Again, People Buy From People. If you want to connect like never before, pick up your copy today of People Buy From People. And now let's get back to more great conversation here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Chris, again, I had your brother Jason on. I've alluded to that a couple of times in the podcast, and we told the story of you and your family. And Jason wrote his book, Live to Forgive. Powerful book. Please go get that. If you're listening to this podcast, go get that book. It's going to help you. Yeah. Forward by Daryl Strawberry. That's big time. That's big time right there.
That is.
Yeah. And so
yeah,
I would be remiss if I didn't get your side of the story, because Jason talks about, first of all, let me start here and going there. When Jason comes to you and your family with the idea of writing the book, take me through your initial thoughts on what he was proposing and what he wanted to do in telling your story.
I was concerned about my dad more than anything else. And, Jay and I have traveled together and actually given some workshops together on this subject. So I've heard Jay say this a lot, that he went to my dad and basically said, look, you're going to be the villain in most of this book. And, gracefully, my dad accepted that, that responsibility. And so thankfully, he consented and the book was written. But for me, I was concerned about that. At that point in our journey, I had been reconciled to my dad. My children had been reconciled to their grandfather. And I have a tremendous relationship with my dad at this point. And so I was sort of protective when it came to that. But, at the end of the day, Jay shared his heart with all of us. I knew that at the end of the day, it needed to be written, it needed to be heard, regardless of how, wide and from actually went. It was important for our story to be told, because our story is so similar to many people's stories, and if it could help just a couple people, then it would have been worth it. And so that was really where I landed at the end of the day.
Was it hard for you to separate Pastor Chris from the personal side of that? Because let me wrap that around this thought. There are things, especially when people enter the ministry, that they say, listen, I would really rather keep that part of my life separate and sheltered. That happened a long time ago. I've reconciled with my dad, but I'd really rather just keep that separate and keep that away from everything. Was it hard for you to reconcile the two worlds, or did you think to yourself, there's a way that I can use this to really, really help people even better, deeper, further, and stronger?
Yeah, there wasn't really a tension with that, Brian. I'll tell you why. I think Jason's probably shared this with you, but I actually was the first in our family to come to know Jesus. And so one of the great, and it might go down, depending on how long the Lord allows me to live, it might go down as my most important moment of my life, after the big ones, accepting Christ, marrying my wife, all that, but was actually leading Jay to Christ, because of his influence and because of where God is taking him. I always look at that as such a critical moment in my life. But when I got saved, it was early on, Brian. It was early on that I encountered the fatherhood of God. I had a father wound so deep that I didn't even recognize it. My whole identity was in was entrenched in that father wound. I was searching for an identity that I could acquire, that I could achieve, rather than an identity that was unconditionally received. And it really stemmed from the lack of a relationship with my dad. Well, amongst all of the revelations that God gave me when he revealed himself to me, early on, it was that he was a father. And when I began to see him as a father, when I began to understand his unconditional love and acceptance, it wasn't a long process for me then to have mercy on my dad, have genuine love for my dad. And so it was full disclosure. I mean, really from early on in my walk, particularly in my 10 years as pastor, it's been full disclosure. And, a lot of that has been helpful for people who've also experienced dysfunction within their most intimate relationships.
How old were you when you first realized the problems that your dad had? Because and help me through this if you don't mind. I think Jason's the oldest, and then it's you, and then it's your brother Damien. And so,
yes, that's right.
And so how old were you when your dad's alcoholism, you first remember seeing it? And how old were you when your parents divorced? Kind of take me through that timeline from your own perspective, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So my parents divorced when I was 3. I don't have any memory of my parents being together at all. I think the first real memory that I have of how my dad's drinking was destructive was playing Little League baseball. And he would show up at a game and he would be so obnoxious, and he would be so just out of control. And that was, we started playing baseball. We were 5 and 6 years old. So I would probably say those are what sticks out in my mind. Most of my relationship with my dad has an attachment to sporting events. He showed up most of my football games, which I was an all conference quarterback. And so he would come to my football games and he would just cause a scene. Basketball, same type thing. So it was early on, Brian. I mean, I don't really have too many memories of him from my childhood when he was sober. That's for sure.
Did you and your brothers try to protect yourselves? Take me through the role that your older brother played in kind of protecting you, because I can sense, and I'm the oldest of 3. There have been times that I've had to be protective of my 2 sisters and be that protector, especially after my dad died. I kind of felt like I had to be that protector to some degree. How was Jason that for you, protecting you in a lot of ways? What did that do to your bond as brothers early on? Because there's what, a couple years between you guys.
Oh,
yeah. And so how important was having that brotherly bond early in your life when there was no father present and that male influence in your life?
So that's a powerful point and a powerful ask. But I just that the bedrock of our family was my mother, and it was my grandfather and my grandmother, my paternal grandparents. So it was my father's parents. They were literally the glue that held us together. Without them, my mother made tremendous sacrifices. Without them, we would not have made it. There's no question in my mind. But the bonds that we formed together, and still remain to this day, my brothers and I, although Jay lives in Connecticut, Damien's in Florida, I'm in New York, we are as close as ever. And we were sort of forced into that because, we all were experiencing the same trauma. We all were experiencing the same emotional and verbal abuse. We were all going through it together. We didn't know, we were too young and too immature to how do we respond to this? And so we clung to each other. And did Jay protect us? Honestly, I don't know how Jay would say it this way, but Jay's always been amazing. He's been so faithful to us. I kind of played the role, though, he always calls me the older, younger brother. I kind of always stepped out and played that role amongst the brothers of being the father figure almost, Brian. And so that was a role I just naturally assumed. It was sort of like on the playground growing up, I naturally assumed being the captain, naturally assumed being the leader. I didn't try. It was just within me to do. And I did that within our family structure as well.
Do you think that what you did in sports and the success that you had in sports, you mentioned being an all-conference quarterback, do you think that helped you at home kind of be that assertive figure at home? Because a lot of guys, and I'll say this, a lot of people that have that assertive, take charge, leadership quality that you have to be successful in that position, whether you're playing whatever level you're playing at, high school, college, professional, you've got to be that take charge guy. And some people find that hard to turn on and off. They say, well, I'm this way. And then did you find that helped you when you got home to say, okay, let me step in here and let me take some pressure off my older brother. Let me take some pressure off my mom. Let me just kind of step in there. Was it natural for you to just, when you got home, to continue doing that?
I think so. I didn't really analyze it too much when I was going through it, but as I reflect back on it now, I'm sure, the football field particularly, but, the baseball diamond and the basketball court as well, they were my sanctuary. I dealt with all of the dysfunction in my home on the field. And so, even when we weren't there, I was working out, we were out playing. We were just so, it filled the void, Brian. And so, yeah, probably naturally, that's just kind of what I did. It's kind of still what I do. I don't apologize who I am, but I certainly don't take any credit for who I am. God, he knit me together before I was in my mother's womb. So, I mean, he knew me, he formed me. This is the way he made me. But yeah, that's probably a good way of framing, my role growing up in the midst of all that.
We're probably going to go a little longer here because I think there's an important part, and Chris alluded to it just a minute ago. There's an important part of his story that you need to hear, and that's the influence of his grandfather, George Romano. They called him Pa. If I remember from the book correctly, they called him Pa. And you talked about your grandparents holding you together. What was the greatest lesson that you learned from your grandfather?
Oh, man. He had this one line, and he was not a man of many words, but he had this one line that he shared with me. It was sort of at the end of his life, but I really believe that it defined him throughout the whole time I knew him. He said that to be mature is to be basic. And he was not a extravagant personality. But when I look back at him, he was so loyal, faithful, dependable. I could call him at any moment of any day. He would have rescued me. He would have came to my assistance. He was a calming, soothing, gentle voice for me. You don't know what you got till it's gone, right? It's what they say. Right. And I'm telling you, when he wasn't there, it was so debilitating for me. It stripped me really at my core for a time. Because he just was there, Brian. He was so faithful. And that's really when I take away, and that's what I've tried to do for my children, is to be a similar presence, a faithful presence.
Was your granddad alive when you had kids?
Yeah, thankfully. My original 4, because we adopted a baby a couple of years ago, but my original 4, he was alive for all 4 of them. So he got to see them all be born.
How was that for you with the influence of your grandfather? Because we have a similar situation. My wife's grandfather just passed away back in November. And I always prayed, Chris, I'll share this with you. I always prayed. I said, Lord, because in the last few years of his life, my wife's grandfather had dementia, but I always prayed. I said, Lord, let him live long enough to see his great grandson graduate high school. Because my dad passed away, my father-in-law passed away. So that was the only grandparent he had left. And even in his weakened state, my wife's grandfather was able to see his great grandson graduate high school. And so I noticed when you were talking there, you said he saw all 4 of my kids be born. How important was that for you? The greatest influence from a male perspective being your grandfather, what was it like for you to see him watch you become a father yourself?
Man, it was so important to me. It was one of the things that, when I think about his influence, and I know I speak to my brothers on this as well, it's a tragedy that every person we know didn't get to know him. I mean, because he was so incredible. So when I think about it that way, he died in November 2007. So my oldest was 7 years old, and then it goes 7, 5, 3, 1. But to have him at some of their Little League games, Samuel's Little League games, Hannah actually played, Little League, and he was there for that. To have him there, to have him experience that, and then to have them experience him, I guess part of the only regret that I have is my kids didn't see him at his best. His health had been failing. So they didn't know him as I knew him. And I've tried to live vicariously, through that by stories and, just the things that he taught me. But yeah, it was so instrumental and so impactful for me to be able to have him experience them during those times.
I've got a few more questions, man. There's just a few more pieces of conversation I want to pull out of this.
Yeah.
Talk about the influence of your grandmother and your mother, the women in your life. Because you mentioned a minute ago, you said we wouldn't have made it without your grandparents. And of course, your grandfather, George, such a powerful influence. But everybody knows behind a great man, there is a great woman. And you've had two great women in your life, and of course your wife being the third. But growing up, talk about the influence of the women, your grandmother and your mother in your life.
Yeah. Well, my mother is honest. She's my hero. My mom, who is still, so important to me. I'm 45 years old. I still look to her. I still rely upon her, the wisdom that she has. She's intelligent. She is someone who is always willing to help other people. And but when I go back to the years of my childhood, and I really begin to sort of catalog all the times where she just stuck her neck out for us, laid down her life. I mean, she didn't teach us the gospel in words. We weren't brought up in a Christian home. But I'm telling you right now, Brian, she modeled Christ-like love and Christ-like devotion to her children in a way that is to me the perfect example of what Christ was talking about. When he said, deny yourself, lay down your life. She did that. She did that in pretty much every aspect of her life. And so we're the fruit of that. We're the living reward of that. And everything that we now get to do. And Jay and I travel a lot. Damien, not so much, but we travel a lot. We have, Jay's got an incredible, influence within his life and his ministry. It comes back to my mom's account. It comes right back to her because she never stopped giving, never stopped loving, never stopped sacrificing.
Wow. That is so powerful because, again, your mom is living through her own trauma with your dad's alcoholism, and yet she continues to pour herself into her boys to make sure that you guys are well. I want to talk about your dad. Your dad had a long and winding journey to get to where he was at. And again, Jason's book, Live to Forgive, tells this story beautifully. Mm-hmm. Take me to the point, you mentioned it a few minutes ago. Take me to the point where you reconcile with your dad and what that moment was like for you. Because as you mentioned, you were the first to reconcile with him because of your walk with the Lord and because you coming to know the Lord and him being the Lord of your life. And again, I'll say this unashamedly as a Christian, the Bible tells us that when you come to God, you're a new creature.
That's right.
The old things are passed away, and behold, all things are become new. And so here's new Chris coming to his father, and you're a brand new creature. You're walking with the Lord, and now you're coming face to face with having to reconcile with your dad. Take me to that moment, what it was like for you, and how everything came together.
Yeah, I had bitterness I wasn't aware of. I had unforgiveness I wasn't aware of. I had anger issues towards him that I wasn't aware of. I don't know if Jay mentioned this to you, but when my dad was sober, he's an amazing guy. I mean, you talk about a real smart guy. My dad was a history teacher before he lost his job due to alcoholism. I became a history teacher. I majored in history in college. Not directly because of him. Wasn't like he was inspiring me, but his love for history obviously impacted me at some level.
And that's amazing, Chris. Chris, let me interrupt you. I don't mean to do that, but let me interrupt you. That is so poignant what you just said, because we were talking earlier and you said, Brian, I'm an Eagles fan because my dad was a Giants fan. I'm a Lakers fan because my dad was a Celtics fan. And it's amazing to me that you ended up embracing something that your dad embraced, when all the other parts of your life were about rejecting those things that your dad embraced. Do you find, I had to go there for just a minute, because there's such irony there that I'm like, okay, wow, this is really cool that in every other part of your life, you were rejecting those common bonds. But in that, you were just like, okay, it's a part of my DNA. It's a part of who I am.
If we had more time, I could tell you more of my testimony, but I can tell you this, that before I came to know the Lord March 29th, 1998, I was 22 years old. Right on the eve of that, I was a senior in college. And Brian, I was becoming my dad. I was engaged to my high school sweetheart. My dad married his high school sweetheart. I was being consumed by alcohol. He was an alcoholic. I was becoming a history teacher. He was a history teacher. I was literally morphing into who he was. He was a coach. I was already at that time. I was already coaching. I was literally becoming him without even consciously being aware of it. And then I collided headfirst with the love of God, and that comes through the gospel of Christ. And that changed so much of the trajectory of my life as opposed to where his life went. But the reality was that was the point at which I began to understand, first of all, what was going on inside of me and what needed now to change. And all glory to God for that.
Well, and let me counter. Yeah, we could go hours, because there's so many layers, and we need to have you and your brother on together and tell the story together. But
be great.
Here's the thing, because of you coming to the Lord, your brother comes to the Lord. I think your younger brother is a Christian, isn't he? Walking with the Lord.
Sure. Yes, sir. Yep.
And now both your parents are walking with the Lord. And so, the Lord used you. All the things that you were morphing to be like your dad, and then the Lord just says, okay, I'm gonna show you what this is really gonna. I'm gonna show you the doors that this is really. Because I'll tell you this, Chris, and I'll share this with you in the audience. The reason I wear contact lenses and a beard is because if I don't, I look like my dad. And I got when I was growing up, I got people compared me to my dad. I wanted to be my own man. And it was funny, when my dad passed away, it was like the Lord just said, okay, all the things you're running from that your dad's traits and things like that, here you go. Boom. And it's like, now I'll say something and my wife's going, oh my word, your dad has returned for a brief moment. And so I understand. I totally understand where you were going with trying to be that separate guy, that I don't want to be associated with those things. So now let me ask you this. I've got two more questions, man. You've been so great with your time. Take me through the relationship with your dad now. Jason mentioned it, but I want to get your perspective of your relationship with your dad now, as he's now a father to you in your mid-40s. a grandfather to your kids as they're young adults. What's that relationship like with you and your dad today?
It's so good. It's so good. I smile every time someone brings it up, because I have genuine, authentic love for my dad. And he's one of my favorite people to talk to. When we talk, it doesn't usually run short of an hour. At least I have to cut it off, because we talk about so much. A lot of it centers around sports. A lot of it centers around my kids. But he also allows me to talk about the Lord and with him, and share with him, what God has been speaking to me and what God's doing in our family and those kinds of things. So, but the reconciliation that has taken place, which started with a decision to forgive, started with that. But the reconciliation now over the process of time that has happened, it's one of my favorite, and it's one of my best relationships that I have in my life now.
Man, that's so awesome. Yeah, we've gone an hour ourselves here, and I want to be respectful of your time. Chris.
Yes, sir.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this. Share with this audience your biggest piece of intentional encouragement.
Yeah. Psalm 126 is one of my favorite Psalms, but it says that when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed again. And what I just want to encourage everyone out there is to dream. And I know that over the last 12 months or so, it has caused a lot of people to stop dreaming, to stop believing, to stop being positive, to stop expecting, good things to come on the horizon. And while we've experienced a lot of tragic things, we all do. None of us get out of this world unscathed. The reality is, in this world, we have trouble. But it is time to dream again. Today, not like tomorrow. Today is the time to dream again, to be inspired, to inspire, and to be a source of encouragement that we all need. I mean, I'm sure as the intentional encourager yourself, Brian, you know that in Ephesians 4, it says that edification is necessary. It's necessary for people because it imparts grace to those around us. And so, yeah, I think that's really what I would say to the wider audience is don't stop dreaming. For me, the Lord has restored all my fortunes. Within that, he's caused me to just throw my tent pegs out as far as I can and live life the way he designed it to be lived.
Well, and again, I'll say this for those that don't understand ministry. There a lot of people put preaching up here at the very top, and preaching is important, and teaching is important. But a lot of times that we've forgotten in these times that we live in, that preaching and teaching can only go so far, but encouragement goes farther. People need encouragement a lot of times more than they need teaching and preaching, because then when they're encouraged, their mind is really opened to preaching and teaching, as you well know. And so it's so good. Chris, tell folks how they can get connected with you. I know when people are hear this podcast, they're going to want to connect with you. What social media platforms are you on, and how do they connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I'm actually my brother has been kind of kicking me in the behind to get more active on Twitter, so I've been doing that. My Twitter handle is CJ Romano 21. CJ Romano 21. Instagram and Facebook, you can find me Christopher Romano. It's as simple as that. And I'm there on social media, and just excited about what God's doing, excited about what we're stepping into in this season. Really, really excited.
My 20-year-old won't let me be on Instagram. That's his platform. If I got on Instagram, it would be all over. But that is what it is. Chris, I can't thank you enough, man, for taking time to join us today on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Again, we need to do this again, and two, we could have gone longer, but I so appreciate you joining me today on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
It really has been my pleasure, Brian, and I would love to be on again. And I think that combination of Jay and I coming on together probably would be a real treat.
I'm telling you, it would be dynamite. Chris, I appreciate you, man.
Thanks, Brian. You too.
My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And of course, the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through his word. If you're not subscribed to the Intentional Encourager podcast, hit the subscribe button wherever you get podcasts so you don't miss an exciting episode where you can get encouraged and stay encouraged. And remember, anyone, anywhere, at any time, any place can be an intentional encourager.